This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. I am so pleased to have Dr. Katelyn Jetelina on the show today. Katelyn is an epidemiologist, data scientist, wife, and mom to 2 little girls. Her day job is as a senior scientific consultant at a nonpartisan health policy think tank, where she advises a number of organizations, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. At night, Katelyn writes the internationally influential Your Local Epidemiologist, which has more than 180,000 subscribers around the world. Katelyn's main goal with YLE is to translate the ever-evolving public health science so people will be equipped to make evidence-based decisions. And of course, we'll have a link to Katelyn's Your Local Epidemiologist free newsletter in the show notes that accompany this episode. Katelyn earned her Ph.D. and master's degree in epidemiology at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, otherwise known as UT Health Houston, and her bachelor's at the University of Arizona. Welcome to the show, Katelyn. Wonderful to have you join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You frequently advise policymakers on complicated scientific issues. What has surprised you during these interactions with government officials, would you say?
Oh boy, a lot has surprised me. Before the pandemic, I was not in policy. I was a researcher. I had a research lab at an academic institution. So I was thrown into this all hands on deck policy experience throughout the pandemic, and specifically in a place in Texas where it was a very challenging landscape with epidemiology and politics coinciding with each other. I think the first thing that really surprised me, at least in the first, I would say, year of the pandemic, was how much policymakers were willing to listen to scientists. I was very surprised about that, especially in a place like Texas. It was an incredible experience of the questions they were asking, of the policies they were thinking, of the innovation around how to get people vaccines, for example. It was incredible. And one thing that piggybacks off of that was the other thing that really surprised me was how impactful policy was, especially during an emergency, that we would all of a sudden start dispatching Ubers to deliver vaccines, and you start seeing disparities actively decrease because we were reaching really populations of need. And so one, I was surprised of policymakers wanting to listen to scientists. Two, I was surprised of how impactful policy was in real time. And the third thing that I really learned and was surprised about as being a scientist was that policy is not just based on science. And we saw this start playing out over time, that policy is a constellation of decisions made, yes, hopefully on science, but also on politics, on culture, on morale, on psychological reasons, on global efforts. And so it's a very complicated intersect, which I think makes it even more exciting and more fun to be a part of.
Yeah, I love how you described it as constellation. It so much is that. And I think it is hard for people who are not in the middle of it to appreciate that until they start to get involved in it. And I'm wondering if you're thinking generally about what scientists do well in these advisory roles, and maybe even also areas for improvement, given your deep experience now in the policymaking world.
Yeah, the first thing I learned was that scientists are pretty terrible at speaking in plain language, specifically to policymakers. Policymakers really just want the bottom line up front, and they don't really need to get into the weeds of why, maybe a few bullet points of the scientific evidence. But a policy brief is literally, if it's good, 1 page. If it's even the best, it's a half a page, because that's all the staff is willing and has the capacity to listen to. And so really diving deep and grabbing that bottom line and putting it up front is the most important in policy. I think that scientists also have a hard time anticipating policymakers' needs. And again, this constellation of tug of war between other priorities that policymakers have to face. And so I think that as scientists need to do a whole lot better at understanding their needs so we can help address them and help policymakers make more evidence-based, data-driven decisions.
Yeah, so true. Thinking more generally about your approach to science communication, are there some go to principles or tactics that you use? You mentioned starting at the end with the bottom line and making it really short and tight. One of my favorite quotes is if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. It's really hard to do that, particularly if you're just starting out and you know so much. But wondering if there might be any other tips or tactics that you use that could be helpful for listeners, particularly who are interested in getting involved in science policy.
Yeah, I think even going out to more of the 30,000 degree view of not just the formula for writing, but the most important thing I've learned in scientific communication is to listen. Hearing is very different than listening. And one reason I think that Wiley has been so successful is because 90% of the content is driven by questions I receive. It's me listening to communities rather than me being an epidemiologist and thinking I know what communities want to hear. Because those two things don't often align. And so I think that listening perspective and opening up a bi-directional relationship with whatever audience you have, whether it be policymakers, whether it be community, whether it be stakeholders or decision makers, is incredibly important. So you can find where to insert that science and that evidence to help make those decisions going forward. So I think that listening part's really important. And then when we start like talking about code crack, I don't know if I have ever cracked a code. It just took a ton of practice over 3.5, 4 years of communicating and writing. But I think there's really four important perspectives when you write something. It's one that you add meaningful context to your audience. Stats without context are meaningless to people, and tell them how that epi affects them today, not in 10 years from now, but today in decisions people are making right now. Second is to reduce the cognitive burden. I think you said this earlier that sometimes scientists know too much.
Hmm.
And I think that we get bogged down in the weeds, but really great scientific communication is this balance between nuance and understandability. And it's truly an art form. And we really need to get better at not getting trapped in these over complex words. And that's really hard for scientists to do. One, add meaningful context. Two, reduce cognitive burden. Three, add stories. So, us humans are storytellers. That is how we have evolved. And some of my most popular viral posts have been just me talking about what I was doing with my kids during the pandemic and how we were approaching grandparents, for example. And then, always in scientific communication, furnish solutions. Always have a call to action. What do you want people to get out? What is the bottom line? What do they need to do today? And when we can connect and translate public health science to action, then I think people feel a whole lot more control. It's a whole lot less scary, and they can actually go do something instead of getting overwhelmed with the facts and information. And so that's what I've experienced. And like I said, I continue to learn. I just read the book called Smart Brevity and getting down to the wire on why and how people think and how they process information, particularly decision makers who are bogged with a ton of information at a point where they really only have minutes to make some decisions.
Yeah. Smart Brevity is a great book coming from Axios and then the Politico
Yeah.
and Washington Post guys. Yeah, they do a great job in that book for all those reasons. Love some of the things you're talking about, Caitlin, which are not intuitive. Thinking about context, telling stories, also getting bogged down in the process and the details. I think about I spent all this time cleaning the kitchen, for example. Say my mother-in-law is coming over and my wife wants me to clean the kitchen. And so I tell her like, all right, it's done, but I had to do this because the kids left this out or it took a long time. She doesn't care about that. Is the kitchen going to be clean when my mom comes over? And so I feel like there's this reflex that we have that we want to share all those details of things that we had to go through to get to that endpoint. But as you're pointing out, as you're saying, there's no time for it and there's no appetite for it and there's no interest in it. Tell me what you want us to do.
And that backstory is incredibly important, right? To keep science evidence based and data driven. But you're right. It doesn't matter how many bowls are in the sink or how many toys were left on the kitchen island, because at the end of the day, policymakers just care about that end goal. It's challenging to scientists because we respect the process so much in science because that's what makes us grow in our knowledge expand. But yeah, in times of decision making, it doesn't really matter at that time.
Yeah. And also your point about the call to action. Okay, what do you want us to do about it? I was in so many meetings over my years on the Hill where there would be a very elegant explanation of the problem. And it'd be like, got it. But what do you want the boss to do? What's the ask? We would always say, what do you want him to do about it? And sometimes there was silence for a while. I was like, I'm not really sure. It was almost like an unexpected question, but that's the business that policymakers are in, right? Is to make change. I want to have you talk more about your fantastic newsletter, your local epidemiologist. And I mentioned we're going to have a link for listeners to subscribe in the show notes. First off, what prompted you to create it in the first place?
So I started in March of 2020, and it was an email to faculty, staff, and students about what the hell was going on with COVID, this new thing called COVID-19. And it was a daily email. It was about to the 30 people. It was very small, but it was me trying to explain the numbers and what I was seeing in Iran and in China and what it meant to us here in the United States. So it was very messy. It was me on Excel. It was 2, 3 short sentences a day. And I signed it your local epidemiologist because at that time I was their local epidemiologist. I didn't know if a better word for it. And then a few days later, one of my students came to me and asked if I could start putting it on social media so she didn't have to keep copying and pasting these emails to her family and friends. And so I did. I started a social media account. And over time, it just grew and grew. And the last time I pulled the stats, it reached 330 million people in 166
Uh,
countries. And so there was a huge gap that I stumbled upon in scientific communication and the intersection of public health.
First of all, it's interesting to hear how you decided to call it your local epidemiologist. And that's because that's what I was at the time. When I read that, I loved it because, of course, I didn't know that story. I loved it because you're local. So it's so relatable. And I think that's a huge part of persuasion. It's like, I'm just like you. I'm relatable. I'm in your community. I'm here to serve you and educate you and answer all these questions. So just the name of it, I think is wonderful. And find out like how it came to be is interesting. But I think it's like strategically very smart too.
Yeah, there was no like thought process behind that. Like it was literally me trying to put out fires in the beginning of the pandemic. But now that I look back, I think that you're right. It shows that I'm a human, that I'm there, that I have a personality, that I'm not afraid to say when I don't know because my audience is my friends. And I would say I don't know to my sister every single day. And I think that having a human face is incredibly important and something that a lot of public health institutions got sorely wrong during the pandemic. That why listen to a brick wall that is the CDC? Why would I trust someone like that and not your local epidemiologist? My friend Andy Slavitt also pointed out that I would always write love your local epidemiologist, and I still do that. And again, it was just something I always just did in the beginning. And he was telling me how that was interesting to him because it's also another level of empathy. And it just shows that I care. Like I really cared about how people are making decisions during a pandemic. And don't be fooled. Like none of this was like planned, branded. It's really just spur of the moment. And it's been interesting to see how it's grown.
Yeah, which just underlines its authenticity, which is another value that people really have, like a real person who really cares. And it leads into my next question, Caitlin, which is about misinformation. And you've done a lot of work there and stamping out misinformation. And it can be really a challenge. You pointed out about trust. Who should you trust when you get information? A faceless bureaucrat, so to speak, or organization, or somebody that you feel you have a connection to. And you've written and spoken extensively about the problem. And one thing you mentioned recently, which I thought was very interesting, is what can we do right now? We're talking in July of 2023. What can we do now to communicate and anticipate RSV vaccine misinformation in the fall, which we may be encountering? And misinformation is something that I've focused on too for a while. And I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on some promising techniques that you have found to fight back against misinformation.
Yeah, so to me, there's really two key pieces to fixing misinformation. Is one, like you're saying, combat misinformation, right? And one way to combat misinformation is, yeah, you can combat each little piece of rumors, but that's going to be a game of whack-a-mole. So a lot of people and a lot of research is showing that it's actually way more effective to teach people how to recognize misinformation, and that can be applied to any piece, whether it's about democracy or health, misinformation, or climate change, et cetera. And we need institutional support with that. And I call that reactive communication. So reacting to these fires. But I think perhaps even more importantly than reactive communication is proactive communication. And that is anticipating the needs of the public, showing up where they're at, listening. Like you said, RSV vaccines are coming in a couple months. What are we doing right now? We're doing nothing because we're very reactive society. And so, how can we bring the public along for the scientific discovery ride? So, when things do come up, we were anticipating them coming up, and the public is prepared and not surprised to be seeing stuff about that particular topic. And that both the reactive and proactive communication is something that is not being built out or integrated very well in public health at all. And I think that it needs to be on every level in academia, in private sector, in government, including institutional courage. And it's unfortunate that it hasn't been rolling out at the rate that it needs to, particularly with new threats coming up.
Exactly. And that's what really terrifies me, is to try to deal with this at scale when you're up against an algorithm that never sleeps. And you also pointed out trust, Caitlin. And I think that really, as I look at it, that is such an important ingredient when you're trying to combat misinformation. And if you're always in a reactive mode, you're starting these relationships after the bad thing has happened or the bad information is out there, then it's really hard to build up trust instead of doing it more proactively, like you were suggesting, and listening. Another big point that you made that is just so important. Most people don't think about that. It's just going to be a broadcast and they'll listen and follow what we tell them to do. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, depending on if you're dealing with a 3-year-old, you do want it to work that way. But you've got a lot of history there. You've got a lot of trust that's built up. So yeah, when we talk about AI now and the need to really figure out new ways to deal with that, so important, that trust factor, and not being on your heels and always chasing it, as you point out. As part of this misinformation and disinformation, which of course is used deliberately by state actors and organizations and probably individuals too, I guess what happens sometimes there is that people who are responding, scientists who have actual facts and evidence who are responding, are getting harassed, to put it lightly. In many cases, it's threatened, and there are very serious situations like that. What do you think is at the root of that horrendous behavior, that kind of really angry, violent, harassing kind of behavior against scientists who are merely trying to get the word out with the evidence and the facts on how to deal with serious health problems, for example?
Yeah, unfortunately, science and particularly public health is becoming more and more politicized. And we saw this turn out with climate change. Still to this day, it's very politicized. But unfortunately, it's coming down to other public health issues like vaccines, for example. And you start getting these tribes of thought, and thinking outside of those tribal groups is getting more and more challenging in the space of social media, where you have these massive echo chambers in which false news spreads faster than the truth. So I think that one, it's the politics; two, it's the information ecosystem that is just changing, right? The truth is no longer dictated by authorities, but it's networked by peers. And then the third thing is, I think, and what I learned throughout the pandemic is there's just a lot of scared people out there
Mm.
too that turn into anger. And humans just don't like being reminded that we're vulnerable species. And so if you are the face of something that shows that they're vulnerable, like a virus or wildfires or gun violence or whatever you want to talk about, that's a really scary perspective. And people don't like that. And so this is not necessarily new in public health. We came across a lot of angry and frustrated people with the tobacco industry example. And like I said, gun violence right now. But it just takes time to talk to people, to change behaviors, and like you said, to build trust.
Implicit in a lot of what we've been talking about is emotion, as you just noted again. Fear is such a powerful emotion. And scientists have historically been trained to be emotionless in their information. So you have this sort of mismatch. And then when you have an alternative that is willing to address that with saying whatever it is to give people something to grab onto that maybe lessens their fear, then they gravitate towards that. So this idea of becoming more comfortable with emotion and listening to get at some of that emotion, I think is so important, as you were noting. As we wrap up, so many listeners are interested in science communication, in science policy, maybe wondering what they can do, what they can learn, what skills they can develop. If you had just maybe one idea, and again, you've noted a number of them, but if there's one thing that you think a listener interested in science communication could do right now after listening to improve their own ability to communicate with general audiences, what would you suggest they do?
I would suggest just trying, just taking the leap and just starting. You have to start somewhere. And I was never, ever trained in scientific communication, not even 1 hour of training, but I learned a lot from just doing. Whether that was to my faculty and students, whether that's now to millions of people, just doing it. And it's not for everyone, and that's okay. But I think that if you're not the one doing the communicating, try and find a mouthpiece that can help you do the communicating, whether it is your media relations person at your academic institution, whether it's me, Wiley, whether it's another social media consulting firm, whoever, Gen Z, your kids can help you create a TikTok video. Just starting somewhere. And if you don't want to, just know where your mouthpiece is, that when you have a really important scientific finding that could really benefit the general public, especially during an emergency, you know who to go to and how to get that message out to the right people.
Dr. Katelyn Jetelina, this has been an amazing conversation. I knew it would be so informative, insightful, based on your experience in surfacing so many important things that people don't necessarily think about. The importance of listening and other aspects and emotion that you've been talking about. Thanks for doing what you do, both during your day job and also your night job with your local epidemiologist, Wiley. Again, we'll have a link to the show notes for listeners to subscribe to that. Really inspiring. Thank you for what you do, and thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks, and I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.